Okay. That word struck Clementine deeply, like he had slashed her in the lungs. She was rendered breathless and trembling as Troy turned away from her. Her eyes widened, heartbeat quick and pulsing. She helplessly tried to meet his eyes. The refused looked at her, instead turning to Tavia and the guards. "I'm in," he said, giving a slight nod. Clementine's entire body went cold, her heart sinking down to her stomach. "What?" She found herself hissing, unable to keep control of her shock contained. "What the hell are you doing, Troy?" The man continued to ignore her, his tone cold and rasped. "I said I'm in." Tavia visibly brightened and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I knew you'd see. There's no really better place for you than Howe's," she said with a smile. "I'm glad to have you back." You can't be serious," Bonnie interrupted in disbelief. "Troy, I didn't think you were this shitty. Are you seriously betraying us?" Scoffing, Troy curled his lips to a smirk. "You call this betrayal? I never saw myself as one of you anyway. You helped me, sure, but I side with the strongest in the end." "The strongest? What in God's name are you talking about?" Bonnie exclaimed angrily. "This ain't some war." Troy stomped closer, throwing his face into hers. "That's where you're wrong. Life is war now, so go ahead and cry me a fucking river." Bonnie seemed stunned by that, scrunching her face in bewilderment and leaning back a bit. But Clementine, she had recovered from the internal shock that left her frustration with him to grow to a point where she could no longer hold it in anymore. She had to say something. She scooted herself towards a few inches, stretching her arms to the full height, or rather, the full weight when kneeling, and glared straight at Troy. "I can't believe you," she spat. "Why would you even then go back to with them? After all we've done for you. After all I've done for you." Maybe indeed a very angry reminder of who fed him antibiotics when he was literally on the verge of death and life, or who chopped up his limb in the first place, allowing him to live and make these traitorous decisions. She was practically seeing red, her heart hammering in her chest. "You saved my life more than once, and I saved yours. Why would you do this?" She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. There was just so much about the situation that didn't add up. Didn't make sense in her eyes. The tiniest light of hope that maybe he was tricking the house guards and still flustered in her chest. But it wasn't very bright. Something told her that Troy was not clever enough to formulate a plan like that anyway. Beside Clementine, Sarah looked to be just as shocked as her body ridged and trembling. "Clem's right. I don't get it. We trust you." She then tried to meet his eyes, only to get connected with him, so she would be like any other human being. But she was refusing to look at either of them. He turned his head away and closed his eyes briefly. "Just shut up, you two," he muttered, eyes opening again and looking everywhere. "But towards them, this is just how it is." That didn't sit well with Clementine at all, but Sarah seemed a little bit more fed up with the vagueness. "But why?" the older girl repeated, thrusting her head forward. "You started to teach me how to shoot a gun, you helped us get the supplies, and took watch at night, and put in your opinion when we made decisions, and you consider us friends?" Tears then welled up in Sarah's eyes as she shook her head. It seemed to be the stress of the situation was all boiling inside her. This was just as inside Clementine. The older girl was much visibly more emotional, though, so it was easy for her to let it all out. She didn't actually cry, however, her face was red with frustration, her eyes dropping with hurt as she desperately tried to understand Troy's decision. But unfortunately, and despite her own confrontation towards him, Clementine was starting to understand. Troy's actions were unpredictable, and thus it can't be comprehended, though they may have had felt once differently about him, and he was truly a coward to all of his very core. And cowards do what they do. "You are part of our group," Sarah murmured, lowering her gaze into the snow. "Once Clem decided to bring you along, I never thought otherwise." Troy opened his mouth, presumably to spit out a retort, but stopped short once he considered the words. His lips pressed into a thin line as his brows scrunched down in almost in confusion and bewilderment, as if though he could not understand why Sarah would truly think of him as an ally. He just sighed and turned his back to them, unable to face the consequences of his actions. Clementine was about to hiss something else, but was interrupted. That was fun and all, Tavia said, rolling her eyes. But if we could cut the drama and have all eyes on me, that'd be great, thanks. Like she said the magic word, all three of the guards stood up straight, lined themselves next to her. From the weapons in her hands and almost maniacal way they moved, they suddenly seemed more like machines than humans. Now, Tavia began, once more looking over the prisoners. As I was saying before, we're all going back to house tomorrow morning. I have 2 cargo trucks here, which you're all familiar with. I'll be driving one with Tyler and Vera, and Lau with Troy in the other. Only one truck has the cargo back door that shuts, so you'll be all taking that one. Lau will be your colfaner tomorrow, so I expect you all to behave and not give any trouble. Once we get back to house, you'll be taken back to the pen. We have a lot of cleaning up to do after that herd, so I expect you to work hard. If I see improvements in the attitude athletic, I may let some of you back inside. What about AJ? Kenny interjected, casting a glance over the box the infant was nestled in. You're going to bait him into the frickin' walkers? Like I said, don't worry about him. He'll ride with me. I never let a baby ride in the back of the truck, let alone leave him out in the yard. What I am? A monster? Nearly everyone in the group opened their mouths for a second and then promptly closed them. Scoffing, Tavia ignored and continued. There's plenty of food in our community for him. I'll raise him to lead house when he grows up. It's what Bill would have wanted. She then nodded to herself with a pleased expression that made Clementine sick. So he's like an heir to your kingdom? Jane spat, but Tavia just nodded. Now you're getting it. Now there's one matter of need to do before we lock you up for the night, Tavia said carefully, scanning the group. Her tone sounded too much like Carver's for Clementine's comfort. The woman turned to Troy. I realize that you know where you belong. I shouldn't worry about you becoming lost again, but I need you to prove your loyalty to me, she simply said. Troy raised an eyebrow. Prove it? Yes, I don't necessarily need you to do anything hard, but do you think you could do what I tell you to do? Tavia asked, narrowing her eyes with the assuming smug. To follow my orders no matter what they are, like you did with Bill. You don't have to say yes, Troy, Sarah blurted out suddenly, but Clementine didn't miss the way Tavia's eyes narrowed to slits, her lips pierced. With only a bit of hesitation, Troy replied, Yeah, of course, I don't got much of a choice if I want to live. That's a good boy. Almost sweetly, she patted his shoulder again and scanned the group and still tied up, kneeling to the ground. Let's see. She studied the victims for a moment. That Russian kid isn't really necessarily. He's crippled to boot. Off him if you would, she said, though. He was merely to sign which paper her office desk to discard. Troy stared at her, his jaw hanging open. Whatever happened to bring them all back? Perhaps I've changed my mind. He could have allies around here, you know. More members to bring in, Troy pressed. Rolling her eyes, Tavia reasoned. And I'm sure they'd come in willingly if we asked them nicely. I hope you haven't gone on soft, Troy. Now, are you going to listen to me, or do we need to have a chat? With a sigh, Troy scowled, but didn't protest anymore. It was clear to everyone, including him, that the term chat implied. Reaching towards her hip, Tavia extracted her pistol and handed it to Troy without a second thought. She had another gun on her side, but Clementine wasn't so sure of giving away the weapons to the people she had just recruited back was a good idea. Regardless, though, Troy didn't take any advantage of that trust. He stepped closer to Arvo with a pistol clutched in his hand. Arvo didn't look afraid as Troy as he was of Kenny, but there was still fear in his eyes, and he trembled as he stared back up to his soon-to-be murderer. Please, no. I thought you asked to kill you before, kid. To go see your sister, yeah? Troy asked, tilting his head. Arvo's eyes widened, realizing he was in fact getting what he was hoping for earlier. Despite still being clearly afraid, he didn't protest anymore, so after Troy pointed to help. Perhaps he was scared, but the thought of meeting his sister again in the afterlife was still enough to shut him up. Everyone else didn't share Arvo's acceptance. They all stiffened, but Mike was the one to move forward towards the teen. It was obvious the way they left together, but in Mike's protectiveness, one of the teen was quite heartwarming in a way. It reminded of Clementine with her own relationship with some of the other adults in her old group, like Lily. But there was no time for fond memories, though, as Troy loomed over the Russian teen, his eyes looking detached and ready to kill. Mike posed like a monster hen ready to attack, his back erect and his jaw clenched tightly. "Leave the kid alone," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "He's done nothing to you, to any of you." "But he wants this," Troy protested, but Mike just made a face of disgust. "You didn't want to be a part of that decision either, remember? So let the hell it go, you asshole," he yelled, spitting in front of Troy's feet. Chewing the bottom of her lip, Clementine watched the scene, wondered what exactly how she would intervene, if she should at all. She swept her eyes over the others, knowing how uncomfortable they looked. Kenny made eye contact with her, and she noted that even he looked a bit of a loss. She would have imagined Kenny would be quite happy to see Arvo executed, but maybe the man thought otherwise finally. Inching forward on her knees, Clementine swallowed hard. "Arvo's part of our group," she said, turning to Tavia and appealed to her. "He could still be useful, and just do as much work with an injured leg." She mentally pleaded with whoever was listening to Tavia to listen to reason. Quickly, Tavia quirked a brow in interest, and Clementine jumped in the opportunity to continue. "You let Reggie live without an arm, not to mention Troy for now. If Troy could do the work, Arvo certainly can." She spat Troy's name in much more venom, glaring over at the man and wishing she could feel every ounce of anger. His eyes met hers for a moment, but he merely frowned and shook his head, looking away like a coward. "She's right," Sarah agreed, nodding. "Arvo's also been through a lot, like us. He's not useless, not at all, though she was definitely intimidated by Tavia, who wasn't it, in this scenario?" Sarah's words were clear, but her voice was firm. Tavia did seem to consider the appeal. She had let out a hand to Troy, stopping the man from stepping any closer to Arvo. "I guess they have a point. Anyone can be used in this community," she said with a shrug. "Maybe I was a bit eager to pick off someone and clouded my judgment. We'll let them be for now." Narrowing his eyes, Troy huffed, but said nothing to protest, stepping back and laying his superior in front of him. Mike flashed a grateful glance over to Clementine and Sarah, nodding his appreciation. Arvo still looked frightened, but gave a thankful glance to them as well, although he'd wished to die. Perhaps it hadn't been as much as originally assumed. He then smiled back towards them, noting now how relieved they both looked. Beside her, Sarah seemed to release a breath she had been holding, but the reality of the situation was lost to any of them. Their combined efforts had saved Arvo's life. However, despite their good feelings, Tavia obviously wasn't finished with the Turantious ideas yet. "Point taken, everyone," she said, addressing to them as if they were her friends. "No need to kill off the potential workers, I'll get that. However, I do need to test you. Troy, what can you do?" Once again, she looked at everyone, her eyes then settling on each person meaningfully, as if she was carefully considering something. Clementine met her eyes and head on from the gaze set on her, trying to seem both unafraid and intimidated as she could be. But it didn't matter anyway, because Tavia didn't move on from Clementine, shifting her attention to the girl next to her. "Aha, I've got it. Both those girls had outbursts earlier, but that one in particular needs a correction," Tavia said, scrunching up her nose like she had smelled something foul. "One smack with that gun should shut her up. Be a dear, wouldn't you?" Sarah sucked in a trembling breath beside Clementine, whispering sounds of disbelief. Her eyes widened with behind their glasses, flashbacks of how a certain way when Carver asked her father to correct her, surely churning in her mind. Even when Troy looked hesitant, staring down at the gun and back to his boss. "Can't I just slap her?" he reasoned, his casual tone sounding focused, and gave a light shrug. "All she did was yap, but don't much think deserves a smack with a gun, you know?" Tavia snorted. "I remember you saying you would slap the shit out of her if Carlos hadn't done it back at Howe's. I'd figure you enjoy getting a step further." Her face darkened as she continued. "Or are you feeling sentimental about these prisoners? Perhaps you'd like to join them on the truck on the way back." A brief look of fear crossed Troy's face, but he carefully recovered and nodded. "No bullshit sentimentals here, gotcha." He then clutched the handle of his pistol, gripped it tightening, with so hard as his knuckles were white. Swallowing hard, Clementine felt a protective urge surge inside her to just press it closer to Sarah. Sure, she was terrified, possibly even more than she had been back at Howe's when her friend was spoken out of turn. Getting slapped by her father was terrible, but the thought of Sarah getting pistol whipped was enough to make her turn her stomach. Troy, don't, she warned as the one-armed man glared at them. She couldn't give her a real answer or response, just stared down at Sarah with a dumb look on his face. Why aren't you ain't scared? He whispered, almost in disbelief. It seemed to be studying Sarah's expression, trying to look for some hints of fear to take advantage of, perhaps? Sarah paused to try to think it over, considering his words before shooting back. Why are you? Silence fell between them temporarily, and Troy closed his eyes and sighed deeply. I don't know what you're talking about, he mumbled. Look, just don't mouth off anymore, and this won't be happening again, he said finally with a low tone, raising the pistol like he would a hammer and nail. Despite being afraid, Sarah lifted her head to make eye contact, something others would have never thought it would be possible for her. But Clementine had enough time to bond with Sarah, knowing that she was stronger than she looked. True, she would have been cowering back at Howe's, but things changed since then. She had grown considerably. Clementine was proud of her strength, but it wasn't easy to cope with the pain the world had brought, and yet Sarah prevailed. Now she stared up at Troy, her expression neutral and almost accepting. For a brief moment it felt like he had moved his lips to say something else, but Clementine couldn't hear anything, and the two fell silent. She wasn't entirely sure, but she hadn't imagined it. It was horrible to end a story. Clementine couldn't help but think. Sarah had done so much to help save Troy's life at one point, but now it seemed to have forgotten of what she'd done, and it was all back at her like a stray dog he was. At least it was quick. With no further ceremony, the pistol mate struck across Sarah's cheek. She yelped as the force knocked her over, smacking her head against the ground. Blood freckled in the snow as she shivered with pain. The sight made Clementine sick. She leaned over to her best friend as best she could, eyes darting out worriedly and searching for any serious injuries. Sarah weakly lifted her head to stare at Troy, who had turned his back on them already. Clementine wanted to break the ropes and held in her arms together to lash out at him. She didn't know how exactly what she would do if she got the opportunity to get her hands on him, but she knew it wouldn't be pleasant. But despite being furious of her attacker, Clementine's first priority was checking on Sarah. Are you okay? She whispered. Thankfully, Sarah nodded. Yeah. Her eyes then clouded with unhushed tears. One of the frame of her glasses cracked a bit from where she had been hit to the ground, not to mention the deep cross in her neck, but her cheek. But overall, she didn't seem too hurt. Clementine imagined it was a shock more than anything else that affected her. Despite all that, Sarah still looked concerned for Troy. Clementine didn't even know how to get her friend to stop looking at the man with such pity, and it disgusted her. What right did Troy have to do to Sarah compassion? An hour ago it wouldn't have been a real issue, but now that Troy had proven his loyalties lied, well, the whole time they were growing closer to him as an ally, or she hated to think a friend. But it could have been just treating him like dirt he was, and the same results would have happened. It infuriated her. God damn, Tavia breathed with a whistle, breaking Clementine's thoughts. She was inspecting Sarah's fresh wound, almost impressed. You really didn't hold back. Why would I? Troy demanded, echoing through his clenched teeth. You asked me to do it, so I did it. I could see that, she said with a shrug. I'm sorry I've doubted you then. But that casual tone wasn't enough for Troy. He scrunched his eyebrows and down with irritation, hissing, What the fuck was all that for, Tavia? Are you getting off of this or something? Clementine didn't know what it meant, but it clearly amused Tavia, for she laughed. Oh, Troy, I miss your vulgarity. Don't worry, it was all a half-hearted test anyway. I have many hang-ups about you, she said. You pass. Now come on, let's get them in the truck. He pierced his lips, but then said nothing, and behind her like the dog he was. Troy avoided every single of their gazes as he stood by the truck, positioned back to attack anyone they dared to try to run. He had only been one armed at that, but the remaining hand was on the hunting knife, one aimed at Slash, and it would have all been over. It also didn't help that Lau and Tyler were standing nearby for backup. Everyone was still tied up by their hands anyway, so it was a moot point to make a quick move. Troy was focusing his attention on the other guard, who didn't sit well with one of the members in the group particular. Can't even look at us, you coward, Jane demanded, her teeth bared with fierce, narrowed eyes. I'm sure Colton and Kylie would have been so proud of you. That definitely made Troy whip his head towards her. shock in every inch of his expression. His mouth hung open, trying to grasp at the words to respond to her. How did you, that's what Kylie would say about you. Hitting a kid not much older than her. Him? Jane then hissed, her tone venomous and sharp mocking. I don't know how do you know them, but it's all an ancient story now. He said, his face betraying with the snarl of his words. He dared to take a step towards her, but it wasn't to be threatening, almost looked stricken. But Jane was having none of it. She shoved him out of the way with her shoulder. Save it, you son of a bitch, she hissed. In turn, his expression melted into anger to match hers. He slowly grabbed her arm roughly, forcing her to keep walking. Fine, get comfortable, Kate, 'cause you'll be there all night. More to Jane, he added slowly, and I got a remorse of saving myself. Besides, it ain't like you ain't give a shit about me. Clementine hadn't seen Jane completely livid. I did, and that's the problem, she snapped, raising her head high and brisking the marching past him. Before he could get another word, Troy just stared at her, dumbfounded for a moment, before shaking his clear head. Hell have thou fury, Kenny mumbled under his breath from beside Clementine. I'll say, Mike said with a nod of agreement, matching Kenny's uncomfortableness. One by one they hopped at the back of Howe's trucks, just as they had when Carver caught them. This time the trucks had mangled and broken, and the walkers had definitely chewed up both the truck they had driven, but of course they were still in one piece somehow. Still, Clementine had having a serious case of déjà vu right now, down to Troy watching carefully to make sure they don't escape. It was her turn to climb up to the truck. She paused and finally made contact with Troy. Her gaze was apathetic as she studied him, her lips drawn into a tight frown. She didn't look happy, but whatever or not it was he wanted to do was irrelevant, and he still did it at the end. He still chose to help the guards. He still hit Sarah with his gun. As far as Clementine was concerned, having a remorse did not matter that little. This ain't anything personal, he murmured. I swear. Whatever, she snapped, turning her head away from him, hopping to the back of the truck. Tell someone who cares that you have to say. She sure as hell didn't anymore. Clementine curled her knees to her chest, unnerved by the dark atmosphere of the truck. The cold floor seemed to see past her clothes and chill her to the bones, and it still took all of her strength to stop shivering. This was not the behavior to show right now, especially since the rest of the group was cracking and crumbling. She wouldn't have Lee back right now, but she wondered what he would do in this situation. He would oppose an attack or think it over. He would have been just as angry as she was at the betrayal of someone she was at the beginning of who care about, or would just let it go and be an adult, like she was having so much trouble doing. It was a bit frightening, really. The more days passed as time stretched on, she couldn't quite remember what Lee chose to do in a conflict. Her choices were becoming her own, influenced by her mentors, but not copying them out straight. Like a sponge, she had tried to soak up all the lessons that Lee had given her up until his very last breaths, but she was still dried out now. She had no rivaling to herself and to try and go in her own way. Deciding to check her friend may be a good start, leaned over towards Sarah as she broke through the silence. How's your cheek? She whispered, realizing that frown was a stupid question, but it looked like it really hurt, so her question was utterly pointless. But Sarah didn't seem upset, thankfully. Honestly, it hurts a lot at the time. I could still feel it throbbing a bit, but it could have been way worse right now. It's not so bad. The girl put a slight smile, and though was trying to keep herself high in the high spirits. It was admirable, really. We match now, Clementine mentioned, a bit dryly. She pointed to her own cheek, which still had a scar from when she had tried to stop Carver from beating Kenny's eye in. Come to think of it, was that Troy struck her too, wasn't it? Perhaps it should have been the first hint at what he was capable of. Still, as much as Clementine wanted to think about how much she wanted to make Troy suffer for hurting her friend, she didn't think Sarah needed another reminder of what happened for now. She decided that if Sarah wasn't complaining about hurting, it was okay to drop for now. Sarah did, at least, find her comparison amusing. With a slight smile, the older girl replied, Yeah, I guess we do. I would have rather made a friendship bracelets, but she didn't try to force a chuckle, but it sounded dry. Still, she was trying to lighten up the mood. Clementine grinned back. Nodding in agreement, some kids have secret handshakes. We mirror each other's scars. It wasn't funny, but it was the bitter humor that they all had was the dark truck. Makes sense, Sarah replied, though her voice trembled. To be honest, though, I'm scared. I would may think that there was something wrong if you weren't, Sarah. Clementine said with lightness to her tone. We're all terrified. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Sarah grimaced, trying her best to smile. I guess so, but what do you think is going to happen to us? I know what they said, but... Biting her lip, Clementine shook her head. I don't know. I guess they'll take us back to house, but after that, I can't tell what if Tavia told us was the truth. Sarah took a deep breath, closing her eyes tightly, trying to calm herself down. She was letting the breathing steady herself, counting just 10, just like she would have done with Nick. Clementine reached over and squeezed through the gentle palm, offering support to her friend as she could. Sarah flashed back an appreciative look as she continued to calm herself. Silence fell between them briefly, allowing Clementine to collect her thoughts. She wondered what state House was in now. Was it still sturdy enough to house people, or were there spots taken by walkers that could easily break in? Was the pen area secure enough for her to sleep safely, or she would have to sleep herself awake just to see the light of morning? Just as her mind spiraled into the dark, possibly, Jane spoke up, though to break through the quiet. Her voice was soft but a bit loud enough for everyone to hear. This may be a shitty circumstances, but at least we're not dead. I'll count that as a blessing, she pointed out. Kenny rolled his eyes. Yeah, because you're the one to always look on the bright side, aren't you? That's not what I mean. I don't intend to stay if I can help it. Look, we all know something is going to Con's plan to escape again. I'm saying their power thing or whatever is going to be on may be our advantage. They seem to be hell-bent on having prisoners, so it won't be like it just was to be executed like that. Bonnie spoke upright, but her voice hushed. I doubt it's going to their heads, but I hate to break it to you. Tavia has no intention of treating us once we get back. I imagine it would be just like how it was with Bill, only this time there's anger and hatred fueling and the violent acts. I guess there'll be kind of few casualties soon. What do you mean? Mike asked cautiously. They did back off as Arvo because we convinced him he was useful, right? Yeah, but that was here. We ain't at Howe's now, but once we get back, Tavia sees that place her to rule like a queen would a country. Bonnie replied with a bitter scoff. Sure, it'll seem like she's being nice at first, but things will change. Maybe it'll start being someone else being overworked, or more accidents like Reggie. But soon it'll be clear what she's doing. Truth is, we know just as ruthless as Bill is, and I know she'll start picking us off once we get back. She glanced back sympathetically at Sarah, whose wound is still flesh on her cheek. Sarah didn't seem to notice, or she didn't want to acknowledge it. Picking us off? She echoed instantly. Her eyes widened. Wouldn't that be wasting all this time they spent tracking us down? Bonnie shook her head. No, because now Tavia knows she's won. If she kills all of us, her terms in her own time in her kingdom, it'll be like an ultimate victory, and Bill's revenge for murder. Her gaze then darkened as she brought her knees up to her chest. Soon enough we'll all be dead, and she'll have AJ to rule next. What about the workers? Don't they need them? Clementine asked, her voice right in her throat. With a nod, Bonnie replied, Oh, for sure, we'll be worked to our fullest potential, and once we're done, I bet they'll be just taking more folks. Plenty of suckers like me straggling around in groups, starving and desperate enough to believe anything. No one spoke a word, processing what was said. As much as Clementine hated to admit it, Bonnie had a point. Tavia and the guards were obviously not interested in running a fair community, not even the false sense like Carver did. No, they had chased down the prisoners just to bring them back, and to strike fear into their hearts, like animals waiting to be slaughtered. And just as Bonnie was correct about AJ as well, the way Tavia spoke of him, it seemed like she considered him as the heir of sorts. Honestly, this sort of system was just a perfect look at how into the world worked right now. Before the walkers, none of this would have been considered acceptable. Howe's would be just a normal hardware store, not a place to be taken to die.